You're on.
Is it too soon? Did you need a couple more minutes? You're pretty much ready.
No, I think I'm as ready as I will be.
All right. Thanks for being here, Mike.
And as Bob said, if you have questions as we're going through, if you address them to Bob in the chat function, he'll determine whether or not we need to interrupt the presentation and come back to something or discuss it at a later time. Cameras should be off at this point. Hopefully microphones are muted so we won't have interference. According to my watch, I have 1 minute before I start. The first chapter of the AUX COM study guide is rather theoretical. We'll be going through several aspects of general radio and nothing really specific to the auxiliary radio, but it's all a foundation for the bigger context. So we're going to be going through nomenclature, characteristics of radio waves, types of circuits, radio telephone systems, cell phone usage, citizens band, which is phasing out, the Coast Guard use of remote stations, some concepts of radio repeaters, which we don't have much use in the 9th District, but may be growing nationally, and some general comments on antennas. So we're going to jump into the nomenclature. Radio signals are transmitted in waves, which can be pictured as the sine curves. One complete reversal of the signal is considered one cycle. The number of cycles that occur per second will be a measure of the frequency. Units that applies are hertz. So 1 hertz is the same as 1 cycle per second. The measure of the wave height from 0 to its maximum strength will be measured in watts. We won't have much use for that other than to know the maximum that's available on various radio services. And most of that will be covered by the radio manufacturers. When a wave is transmitted, you'll see continuous series of cycles. In this particular example, they're pointing out that 3 complete cycles are completed in 1 second. So that gives you a frequency of 3 cycles per second or 3 hertz. Of course, for radio operations, it will be extremely faster and much more than you can visualize. To help make the numbers workable, we'll be working with prefixes to the numbers. For the first 1,000, there's no prefix and you just talk in terms of hertz. For 1,000, the prefix will be kilo. For 1,000,000, prefix is mega. And if we get up to 1,000 million, we're giga, and very seldom will we be in that range. Most of our radio frequencies will be kilohertz or megahertz. One of the questions they will ask you will probably be to convert. And remember that each one of these changes is 3 decimal places. So if you are looking at a rate of 2,182 kilohertz, that could also be expressed as 2.182 megahertz or decimal 002182 gigahertz. Or if we went back to the basics, 2,182,000 hertz by adding 3 places or moving the decimal point 3 places to get the related conversion. This is the only type of question I remember in the course where they ask you to convert with the various prefixes. Spectrum is a term to talk about a range of frequencies. Probably the lowest will be the audio spectrum, those that you can hear in your ear, will be cycles from 15 to 15,000 hertz. Instead of 15,000, of course, we could express that as 15 kilohertz. The radio spectrum that we're dealing with will go from 30,000 hertz or 30 kilohertz to 30,000 megahertz or 30 million kilohertz. For convenience, we divide the operations into various bandwidths, and some of the frequencies you want to be familiar with. From 300 kilohertz to 3,000 kilohertz, we're in a band referred to as a medium frequency. That's normally lumped also with the 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz, the high frequency or HF. This was the band for the old-time marine radios. We'll be talking about that similar band using new technology with the single sideband radios. The newer radios, the very high frequencies from 30 megahertz to 300 megahertz, would include the VHF channels of 6, 16, 22 alpha, and the channels we're most familiar with in the marine band now. The EPIRB beacon frequency, 406, is in the UHF, ultra high frequency, and those are probably the only band spectrums that you need to know by name. Another way of measuring the radio frequency or the radio performance is using the wavelength of the signal. Radio waves are traveling at the speed of light. Typically, we use a figure of 300 million meters per second rather than the anglicized 186,000 miles per second. So using 300 million meters as your length of 1 second of travel, by dividing that by the frequency of the signal, you will be able to calculate the wavelength that's being achieved by the radio. So if we took the distress frequency for VHF, 156.8 megahertz, and we divided that into 300 million, we're going to come up with approximately 2. So the wavelength for the distress channel would be approximately a 2-meter signal. Bandwidths are groups of frequencies put together. Some of the signals will be amplitude changing. That was the old AM radio. The VHF signals that we use now are frequency modulated, where instead of changing the size of the band, we're changing the wavelength to get the carrier to convey the information. We'll go into a little more depth in a moment, but single sideband is a fairly new approach where we take the AM signal and break it down to just use the necessary portion to more efficiently use the power. FCC regulations will determine what type of signal is authorized in each frequency spectrum. When we talk about day and night in this section, we need to recognize that we're talking about 2 hours after sunrise or 2 hours before sunset as the border. So daytime doesn't start at sunrise, but actually 2 hours afterwards. Similarly, nighttime reverses it. So 2 hours before sunset, the night session begins and continues until 2 hours after the following sunrise. Moving into the radio operation, the radio will be designating a particular frequency for your transmissions, but you're actually using more than just one single number. You'll have some sort of spread. The new radios focus all of the power into a narrow bandwidth. Earlier radios had the signal spread out farther. By condensing the bandwidth, we're able to get more communications channels into the same spectrum, and it's more efficient for operations. Unfortunately, that meant a few years ago, all of our radios had to be replaced with equipment that had more technological focusing circuitry. The frequency allocation table is rather massive, and there are a lot of different services that like to use the radio. The marine section is a very small portion, and this is available from the internet. It's not specifically part of this course, but you can begin to see how they will specify each range of frequencies for a particular service, and those services are given preference in those ranges. Throughout the service, though, you will find there's one overriding element which involves safety. Almost anything else can be done in the name of safety when it's necessary to save life, and the rules will be overlooked in order to get the safety aspect. Radio waves, when they're broadcast from the radio through the antenna, will go off in all directions, but as they pass through the atmosphere can have two effects: reflection or refraction. Reflection is like a mirror and it'll be bouncing it back. Refraction is twisting it or bending it so it can go off in a strange direction that you may not be expecting. The intensity of the signal will be determined by the type of antenna that you're using and the amount of power that's being used to generate the signal. Generally, the power is going to be limited by regulations. The distance that your signal can cover will be inversely proportional to the square of the distance, which means the farther you go, the faster the signal will die out. So trying to make sense out of the diagram they've given you, the center of the little red dot is supposed to be a handheld radio. And the darker the red, the stronger the signal. So as you move away, you see it getting lighter and lighter pink to a point where suddenly the signal is not noticeable. Radio waves may be reflected back or may be refracted in other directions. We'll have some diagrams that will make this a little clearer. The signals going into the ionospheric area and bounce back are referred to as sky waves. This is a range from 50 to 250 miles in altitude, sometimes varying in daylight and night. Other atmospheric conditions can also affect them. But with the old radios, this would give you a far greater range, sometimes more than you wanted. Operating out of Chicago area, we could normally talk to our boats easily on the daytime, but at night we were fighting the communication stations from Boston and New Orleans because the signals were bouncing into our area. The tropospheric layer is lower than the ionospheric and doesn't have as much effect as the ionosphere, but it's another aspect that you have to consider as you're determining your radio usage. Ground waves are those that stay close to the surface. There may be a slight refraction, but for the most part, it would become line of sight. The signals in the HF and MF bands have the characteristics of quite easily bouncing off the ionosphere. So you can get a dramatic increase in range from the horizon that's visible by bouncing your radio signals off the higher atmosphere. One of the problems is some of these signals won't bounce, but instead they go through the atmosphere and refract. For this reason, you sometimes have to try different frequencies in the HF band to find one that will be bouncing effectively in the period of time that you're transmitting. But recognizing that with the proper frequency bouncing off, you can go hundreds, even thousands of miles over the horizon to talk with other radio stations. Similarly, you can talk directly with the ground wave to vessels that are closer. The difference between the range available with the ground wave and the range with the sky wave reflection is referred to as a skip zone. And the entire distance is your skip distance for communications. For our purposes, we will very seldom be using HF radios unless you get involved in some of the long-range auxiliary communications programs. If you're communicating from vehicles, boats, aircraft, almost all of your communications will be in the VHF range. The time of day affects the characteristics of the ionosphere. So as the day changes, you may need to change the frequencies to find something that will adequately bounce. So at night, the higher frequencies will have a tendency to penetrate, and the lower frequencies will have a tendency to reflect. The VHF range, being a higher frequency of signal, has very little tendency to reflect off of any of the atmospheric levels. It does occasionally happen, but nothing that you can count on. So one of the advantages of the VHF for marine operations is it is a line of sight communications. You're not going to be fighting radio broadcasts from thousands away in order to communicate with the boats close to you. The higher your antenna, the farther you can see to the horizon, and the greater the distance you'll be able to reach with a VHF signal. They tell you that the VHF radio will go slightly beyond the visual horizon, but for the most part, I would consider that to be your effective range. Of course, not only your antenna, but the height of the antenna you're transmitting to will affect the range. So it says VHF waves, beam skyward, don't come back. "15% farther than the visible horizon" is what they will tell you in the text. We'll talk a little more about the VHF in a moment, but one of the things that also makes this a good system is that the requirements for each radio require them to have a low power setting as well as a high power. Every VHF radio has to be able to transmit at least less than 1 watt at low power setting, so that when you're communicating with a close station, you don't have to use unnecessary power, which means you interfere with fewer people. Now, radio channels will be designated as either simplex or duplex. A simplex channel means you are going to transmit and receive on the same frequency. Most of the radios that are, or most of the channels that are used in the marine band are going to be simplex. So on the distress channel, you are transmitting on 156.8 megahertz, and then you're listening 156.8 megahertz. Everybody's on the same frequency. That eliminates a lot of confusion, but it also means that if 2 stations are broadcasting at the same time, one of them is going to obliterate the other, and somebody is not going to be heard. The channels are designated by international treaty, but some of them have been altered by national policy. And channel 22 is one of those. 22 is a duplex channel in the international scheme of channels. But in the United States, we've decided we're just going to use 1/2 of the frequency. So that's why you will hear the reference 22 alpha. There also exists a 22 Bravo, but we don't use that. I believe the Canadian Coast Guard does use it. So they're using the Bravo and we're using the Alpha. The duplex concept says you're going to transmit on one frequency and receive on the other. One of the purposes that this became useful was for radio telephone transmissions. So the shore station would transmit to all of the boats on one frequency, but the boats would send in to them in another frequency. This meant the boats only heard half of a radio telephone communication. Didn't provide absolute security, but it cut down some of the information that people could pick up. It also meant that while one side was transmitting, the other might be transmitting simultaneously. When these stations are used to forward from one to another, one station can be receiving on one of the frequencies while it's transmitting back on a separate frequency to other people listening of different locations. Radio telephone systems for ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore that we're going to be concerned with are the HF, which will be in the single sideband range of 3 to 30 megahertz, and the VHF, which will be frequency modulated FM, 156 to 162 megahertz. Not all of the frequencies in these range are going to be available. You'll have to look up the tables available from the FCC to know which channels are used. And out of those, some of those channels have specific purposes. So you will need to be using the channels that are appropriate for your transmissions. In the Marine service, we have 3 basic reasons for any radio. Number 1 is safety. Safety overrides everything else that the radio is used for. Second priority is operational. Movements of vessels, again, maintaining safety amongst the vessels. And the third function is business. You may notice there is no category here for recreation or chit chat or visiting with friends. The VHF range does have some provisions for non-commercial communications, but it's not a replacement for a telephone. If you want to just be doing personal communications, don't use the marine radio. Number 1 function is safety. In order to promote safety, each radio system has a designated international distress and hailing or calling frequency. The concept is everyone who has a radio is going to be listening to this frequency. If somebody is in severe trouble, distress, they're going to make it known on this frequency, and everybody else with a radio is going to know. So you're going to maximize your chances of getting assistance. In the HF band, the distress frequency was 2182 kilohertz, also known as channel 51. And this is a number you need to have memorized. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard is phasing out their monitoring on HF, so you probably will not be able to reach them on 2182. In the VHF band, the distress frequency is 156.8 megahertz. Channel designation is channel 16. And this is another question that you will undoubtedly be asked, probably multiple times in the test. The Coast Guard does maintain continuous monitoring on channel 16. It is also used for calling and answering, although there will be some exceptions. And vessels that have a marine radio are expected to monitor channel 16 when they're not actively using the radio on another frequency. So if someone is in trouble, people in their vicinity will be aware and should be able to speed to their assistance. Another advantage of having everyone listening on this frequency is that general information broadcasts will reach the entire boating community. Weather warnings, navigational safety information, vessel movement. When a large vessel is approaching a narrow channel, they'll make an announcement that they're coming through to check to see if there will be any conflicts in the movement of vessels. Second priority is operations. Again, navigation. Larger vessels, which are more restricted in their maneuvering, will be able to clarify their intentions before they get into hazardous situations. Sometimes they need to deal with the logistics of their movement and the business to actually convey the vessels to port and out of port can be conducted on the radio as well. Some of the channels that you will have brought before you on the test in the HF band using single sideband, you will be expected to know 2182. Of course, we aren't going to run into this on the Great Lakes much. It's more for long distance communication, so you're going to find it in the oceans. The skip, of course, increases the range. But besides 2182, one of the questions they typically have asked is, what is an HF frequency that you can use anywhere? And typically, that's in the wrong place, I think. I think 2638 is the frequency that they're going to want you to know. Because 2638 can be used anywhere for communication between vessels. So don't pay attention to the bottom circle, move it up. In the HF band, 2182 is used as channel 16 on VHF. So it would be monitored by vessels, and if you were in trouble, a broadcast on that frequency should reach a maximum number of vessels to come to your aid. Although it's no longer monitored by the Coast Guard, you will still hopefully have vessels listening. The HF system has been changing. They say, as a side note, that there are other frequencies. And when we start talking about digital selective calling, you have other options besides the radio transmissions. But we still study 2182 as the distress frequency. I started in the beginning talking about AM radio. And in an AM radio, you would have a central carrier, and then the signal would be on either side of that frequency to carry the information of the voice. It was a very inefficient system. So some radio technologists got together and they started thinking, how can we use the power more efficiently and get a better reception? And they decided, rather than duplicating the information on either side of the carrier, what if we only used one side? So instead of putting information on either side, let's just pick one side. In the United States, for our marine communications, they picked the upper sideband. And now you can take all of that power that was going to the lower sideband and the carrier and pump it into the upper sideband with of greater effect to transmit your messages. It seems to be working in the radio system. People are happy with it. It minimizes distortion, it increases the effective power. The actual power is the same, but it's more effectively used. And because you can transmit on an upper band and a lower band, it doubles the number of channels, although at one time we're only going to be using the upper band for our marine uses. Reduces the interference amongst other stations. And I guess I jumped over that too fast. And it suppresses a carrier signal. I don't exactly understand why that's an effect, but it says it's an advantage. Now the VHF uses frequency modulation. It gives a cleaner signal than AM, but it takes a wider bandwidth to transmit the information. The band is broken down into channels. In the early days, you had to purchase a crystal pair, a transmit and a receive crystal for each channel you wanted to use. After a few years, engineers learned how to synthesize the crystal, and today you can buy radios very economically that will tune to any of the marine channels. This is a blessing and a curse because people now have access to channels they have no authority to use. And people can switch to any of the channels that are not being used, whether or not they are supposed to be using them. Some of the channels are automatically switched by the radio to a duplex mode. A channel like 27 or 26 would normally be a radio telephone frequency, and that would be in a duplex mode. If your radio is adjustable for country of use, if you can set it in the US setting, it will probably take channels like 21 and 22 and 23 and make them simplex, 21 alpha, 22 alpha, 23 alpha. In the old days, when you went to a radio store and you said, I want channel 22, you got a duplex channel. So you could hear the Coast Guard calling you, but the Coast Guard would not hear your response because you were transmitting on a different frequency. The VHF radio is limited in range to essentially the horizon. The higher the antenna, the greater your range. A handheld is limited to just a couple miles, although if you're talking to a high antenna, you can sometimes go 10 or 15 miles to a handheld. Maximum for a marine station is 25 watts, and it must have a function to be able to shift to a 1 watt or less for operations in harbor or around other vessels. Channels, again, are designated for various use, and I believe the book has the entire list. Most marine radios also come with a list. Some of the channels that you'll need to know. Well, let me back up here. Channel 16 is the distress and calling channel. Channel 6 is not on this table, but channel 6 is a ship-to-ship frequency that every vessel is required to carry if they have a VHF channel. So if you call somebody on 16, you can always shift to 6 if you're talking about safety. Channel 9 is designated as an alternate calling frequency. We'll talk about that in a moment. 13 is designated as bridge to bridge, which is a channel for talking between vessel operators for vessel safety. 21 alpha, 22 alpha, 23 alpha are Coast Guard frequencies. And channel 70 used to be a voice communications channel, but it has now been redesignated for data transmission in digital selective calling. And we'll get there in a couple minutes. Because a radio talks to everybody in the vicinity, it's a good way to pass information when you're in trouble. A cell phone has some disadvantages. The first one being you don't always have cell phone coverage far from shore. Even when you have cell phone coverage, you're only talking to one person at a time. And while you may be talking to the sheriff or the Coast Guard or the fire department, the person that's half a mile away from you is not getting the information that you need help. So on the water, we still recommend the use of a radio for safety purposes. Cell phone coverage is not consistent. Coast Guard does not monitor the frequencies directly. You have to dial the station, and then you're only talking to one station at a time. They're intended for private communications, and the VHF would be received by everyone around you. Several years ago, there was a push for citizens band radio. It was considered a cheap alternative to the marine radio. And the Coast Guard actually tried putting radios in their stations, but they very quickly abandoned that because the CB radio didn't have some of the functions of the marine system. One of the biggest things was it didn't have a distress frequency that everybody was monitoring. They designated one channel to call for emergencies, but people didn't have to listen to it. Now the Citizens Band has kind of expanded into different functions, such as the Family Radio Service, the FRS or the GMRS, or there was another one in the book, and they all have the same problems. They don't have any standard place where people are going to provide emergency information or warnings. Nobody's required to listen to it, and governments don't monitor it, so it's not considered a replacement for the marine system. They also have power limitations. In the CB days, there were jokes about linear amplifiers sometimes increasing the power many times beyond the legal, but they can result in rather hefty fines if you aren't careful. A remote base station is simply a radio that is located away from the operator. An example of that might be the sector office in Milwaukee has control of a number of stations around Lake Michigan. So at night, when you just have one watchstander in Milwaukee, they can talk through a radio in Chicago, in Michigan City area, St. Joseph, Grand Haven, Manistee, Sturgeon Bay, and they can control each one of these remotely. So a radio receiver and transmitter are connected for long range operations. Sometimes they do this to put the sites on higher locations, bluffs or tall buildings. There used to be one on the Sears building in Chicago. It allows one watchstander to monitor multiple locations. And some of the high sites have capacity to use more than one frequency at a time. Most of the Coast Guard sites will have channel 16 and a working marine frequency and some additional unique Coast Guard frequencies, all of which can be controlled from the same remote site. Repeaters are not part of the marine system per se. The Coast Guard Auxiliary is starting to implement repeaters in their auxiliary communication system, but outside of the marine band. They cannot be used on the marine band. On a repeater, the repeater is listening on one frequency, and anything that it receives, it rebroadcasts on its transmit. Civil Air Patrol in Chicago had a repeater, again on the Sears Tower. So with a handheld radio, you could reach the repeater in a range of 50 miles, and then the repeater would extend the signal another 50. So you could talk to somebody 100 miles away with a handheld radio going through the repeater system. By putting it in a high location, you maximize your range. Now, these are not in the marine band. They are strictly auxiliary only frequencies, and they'll be brought up in a later chapter, but they wanted to reintroduce at this point the idea of a repeater. They say they're extremely useful in a disaster situation. There have even been provisions of putting a repeater in an orbiting aircraft, so that if you have extreme destruction in a particular area, you could put a repeater overhead and use handheld radios to communicate through a large group of people by bouncing the signal up to the aircraft and then rebroadcasting it back down to the ground. In order to avoid chaos, such a network needs to be carefully controlled. Typically, there will be a station designated as the net control, and they will determine who has priority on using the repeater. Some repeaters will also have additional features, such as allowing incoming signals to be diverted into a telephone system. We won't discuss that very far tonight. The last section of chapter 1 deals with antennas. The antennas for the HF signal are rather large and cumbersome. This is a good reason not to use them on boats. Not only are they rather large antennas, but they usually require a very significant grounding. So if you're dealing with a metal boat, there's no problem, you can tie it into the hull. But if you're dealing with a fiberglass boat or wood boat, you need to mount a metal ground plate on the hull so that you can get an adequate ground for your signal. VHF antennas can generally be built much smaller. Most of the ones you see on boats are going to be fiberglass with a metal element built into them. They're smaller, they're easier to mount. They will be rated with a gain factor, which we'll discuss again in another slide here. 3, 6, 9 are the common ones. You might even have a 1. The higher the gain, the more focused the signal. Not always a good thing. What this means is if we take this little antenna in the center and you figure the signal is going to be going out perpendicular to the antenna. If your antenna is a 3 dB antenna, it's sending the signal out in a manner that's imagined by these large circles. So some of the signal is going out perpendicular, some is going up, some is going down. It's going all around. That's a lot of wasted effort if you could focus it correctly. A 6 dB is going to focus the signal more horizontally and give you a stronger signal aiming toward the horizon. And the 9 dB is going to be even more focused. So overlaying the 3, you see the 3 dB is much broader, 6 dB closer, 9 dB in the middle. Why don't we always go for the 9 dB? Well, the reason is sometimes you don't want that much focus, because if your boat is not perfectly still and your mast is not perfectly vertical, if your signal is focused perpendicular to the mast, your signal may be shooting over or hitting the water before you get to the station you want to talk to. Or if you're rolling, they may get partial message and then it breaks off as it rolls out of their range. Where a lower dB will give you a broader transmission, and it may keep the other vessel in the reception zone longer. Of particular concern would be on a sailboat, which is quite frequently rolling from side to side, and a 9 dB antenna will frequently be losing signals connection when you're rolling back and forth. So a sailboat will typically have a 1 dB or at the most 3 dB antenna, whereas a very large stable power boat would probably use a 6, might use a 9. As you choose your antennas, you also need to have some thought of where you're going to use it. On land, you have several options, and one of them is whether you want a directional or a omnidirectional. The Coast Guard has picked antennas around Lake Michigan so that their signal is going primarily out into the lake. If you are behind the site of the antenna, you may not be able to talk to them. We've had problems in Manistee where boats back in Lake Manistee cannot talk to the big radios. We have to keep a local radio turned on to have any communications with them. Any antenna is likely to draw lightning. So you will see in the book, one of your goals is to provide lightning protection, particularly if you're on land. On a boat, they figure that the grounding will typically provide a lot of the lightning protection, but you also want to disconnect your antennas during lightning storms so that you don't blow out the radio if you are struck by lightning. A radio station is going to be described somewhere in your reading as having 3 main components: power source, radio equipment, and antenna. The antenna feed line is a critical part. And wherever you are establishing an antenna, be careful of your environment. Do not erect an antenna in the vicinity of power lines or telephone lines. Be cautious of the installation and the people installing it so that you don't have hazardous incidents. Okay, Bob, they've got 2 slides of questions here, but they're all the questions from the book. So do you want to take over the homework here?
I can. So question 1, the question is, okay, we can do it that way too. So we're going to take a break in just a second, but everyone, if you got your books open to where you put your quiz answers, I'm just going to go through it very quickly and then we're going to start. So look at your books under chapter 1 study questions. Number 1, the correct answer is C. Number 2, the correct answer is A. Number 3, the correct answer is D. Number 4, the correct answer is B. Number 5, the correct answer is D as in Delta. Number 6, the correct answer is C. Number 7, the correct answer is A. Number 8, the correct answer is B. Number 9, the correct answer is D. Number 10, the correct answer is D as in Delta. Number 11, again, the correct answer is D as in Delta. Number 12, again, the answer is D, all of the above. Number 13, the correct answer is A. Number 14, the correct answer is B. Number 15, the correct answer is A. And number 16, the correct answer is D as in Delta. So what we are going to do is give everybody a quick break here. I show 54 minutes after the hour, and let's reconvene at 8. If you guys have any quick questions, you can turn your cameras on right now and go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, plan on getting back here at on the hour.
Sounds good.
And I saw you put in there that you gave me your member number. Now, the new way that AUX Data 2 works, you are going to be entering this as 99 Delta time. So this is training time. Pete,
So,
go ahead, Pete.
on question number 8, you said the answer was B, and I think it's supposed to be C.
One of these is a typo.
Oh, okay.
Did everybody else get C for number 8?
Yes.
Yes,
So forgive me, everyone. The correct answer for number 8 is C. It's funny that they just updated this manual and everyone's known that C was the correct answer and nobody updated it. Sorry about that. Good catch, Pete. Thank you for doing that. And thank you, whoever else, Joe, I think that was you jumped in.
Actually, number 8 is a lousy question because 16 is the channel for 156.8. And to give you 2 things that close is a bad question.
Good. Any other questions?
Yes, I was wondering about number 6.
Number 6, skip is most often found within what range of frequencies? And that's 2 to 30 megahertz.
Okay.
That would be the HF band.
How about number 12?
Oliver, number 12, what is a radio repeater? So the correct answer is all of this. So A says a radio station that receives on one frequency and retransmits to another frequency. Mike did a nice job explaining this. B is also correct, a radio station that can be a relay. Remember when he was talking about the handheld and how you could transmit up to 100 miles? And C says a radio station that can extend the communication range. So the correct answer is D. It can do all of those. So if you put A, B, or C, you were kind of on the right track, but the best answer in this case is that it's able to do all of those.
Could you please repeat the correct answer for number 9?
Number 9, the correct answer is channel 13. So this says the bridge tender will likely be listing on what channel. And remember how we said channel 13 was bridge to bridge? This was kind of a hot topic before our class started in terms of many bridge tenders around the corner have read this, that the bridge to bridge frequency is channel 13. But that really referred to the major vessels. They call their helm, the area where the main controls are, is the bridge. So when they said bridge to bridge, they meant between two large ships where the captains are speaking to each other, whoever's running the boat at that moment. But in this case, they've kind of jumped on the bandwagon here and said channel 13, D is the correct answer. So for purposes of the test, look for channel 13 as being the correct answer, even though the intent was really to have channel 16 be the bridge frequency to be monitored. So that's a little confusing.
All right, thank you.
That's a
It
good
is
question.
one of those regional things also. There are areas where the bridges monitor 13, but around here, most of them monitor 16 and 12.
AUX, who is that?
That's me,
Who's me?
Pat Musman,
You're gonna have to spell your last name for me, Pat, and say it slow.
Musman.
All right, I'll show you being Pat so we know who's asking. What can I do for you, Pat?
Oh, I don't have a question.
I have one little comment here.
Go ahead, Oliver.
The appendix A, it says study question answers. Here, this would be page 111 and 112. This is for chapter 1. Going back again to question 12, according to this, the answer is C. Based on what's read on page 14, not D. So I don't know, that's why I had, so you might want to check that page because it's giving, and that would be this, and the same thing happened with the question number 8.
Yeah,
The,
8, as we said, is the bad one.
Yeah, but at least I'm just going on pages, I guess this would be page 112. In terms of the answer, according to this, the answer is C, not D.
Mike, do you have any answer to that? Because my understanding is that D is the correct answer for that question.
I chose D, but I do not have the answer key there to compare at, and I will look at it more carefully for next week.
Okay.
You know, sometimes they put little differences in the wording that they try to distinguish, but I was only a maths teacher. I don't understand all this auxiliary stuff.
Very good questions. All right, thank you all for participating in that section. And if you
Oops.
go ahead and
Well,
shut off your video, and we're going to get started with chapter 2. You're doing great, Mike. Thank you very
there
much.
we go. If I can get the right PowerPoint loaded, I will. There we are. All right. Start. Okay. Chapter 2, for the most part, talks about voluntarily installed marine telephone station regulations. So we'll talk about station and operator licenses, frequency assignments, station identification, required documents, other regulations, revocation and suspension, summary of radio telephone operating practices, and a bunch of alphabet soup we'll talk about when we get there. All right, we're going to talk about installation in vessels that are not required to carry a marine radio. If the law says you have to have a marine radio, the laws are going to be different for you. But for a recreational boat that doesn't have to have a radio, we're going to be discussing how you can do that. It says rules change constantly, so always keep an ear out for changes. We're going to be talking about station license, which involves the license for the radio and the boat owner, all of which have to be designated on radio licenses. If the boat is sold, if you get a new owner, if you get a new boat, you need a new license, and it all starts all over again. Similarly, there are licenses for the operator. This means that the person who is operating knows the regulations for using it. And if they don't operate appropriately, the license can be taken away, which means they no longer can use a radio. Now, back in the old days, we all had to have an FCC regulation or FCC license. And then about 40, 45 years ago, they changed the law and said, if you are a recreational boat, you don't have to have a radio, and you are operating in United States waters, and the only electronic radio or transmitters you have are VHF FM, a radar, an EPIRB, emergency position indicating radio beacon, and AIS, automatic information system. You do not have to have a license from the FCC. Saved a big expense, saved a lot of paperwork. If the installation is not voluntary, or if you're operating out of US waters, this would affect us if we were going into Canadian waters, or if we have an HF radio, or if we have a satellite transmitter, then we have to apply for an FCC license. That will be a 10-year license, and I believe it costs something like $160. And they will give you a call sign that you will use to identify your transmissions. The license that you receive from the FCC is supposed to be posted in the vicinity of the radio. They do make a provision if your boat is an open fishing boat or something exposed to the weather, then you can carry a copy of the license in a safe place, but it has to be available for inspection anytime law enforcement asks you for it. If you need a ship station, you can request the issuance of an interim station license, which they can provide you when you are applying for it. And as it comes due for expiration, you need to submit your renewal in a timely fashion so that you have time to get it before it expires. Otherwise, you are no longer authorized to use the radio. If you are not going into Canadian waters, you probably are not going to require the license. The operator license, when I first joined the auxiliary, was required in the United States, and then that was also dropped if you are not operating outside of the United States. So now, if you are operating a voluntary installation and you are not in foreign waters, you don't need an operator license. If you are operating in other countries' waters, you should get the restricted radio telephone operator license, which essentially says, I know the laws and I will obey them and I will be legal. It used to be a free issuance. Now they're charging for it, but the prices came down recently. Now they're only charging $35. That's not too bad. In order to be authorized to make adjustments to marine radios and to conduct official tests, you must be licensed as a first-class radio telegraph licensee or a second-class radio telegraph licensee, or hold a general radio telephone operator license. You will need to know those categories for people who can legally adjust your marine radio. The big reason for having a license is to be able to take it away if you don't respect the rules. If you respect the rules, there probably is never a need for it. We talked about the distress and calling frequencies in the first section. In the HF band, it's 2182. In the VHF band, it's 156.8 megahertz, channel 16. Generally, they will give you both so that if you recognize either half of it, you'll be able to figure out which one it is. Your radio stations should be listening on these frequencies, the appropriate one for your band, when you are not actively using the radio for other purposes. Because of overwhelming radio traffic on channel 16, they developed a system for recreational vessels to use channel 9 as an alternative calling channel. There was some discussion when this was implemented, and the Canadians insisted that they want everybody listening to 16, whereas in the United States, they tried to say, well, let's use 9 in place of 16. The Canadians won. So now the procedure is you should be listening to 16 at all times, but you can also listen to 9 and use it as an alternative calling between recreational boats. Commercial vessels and all official broadcasts will continue to be on 16. They have developed a new communication system, which is a data transmission called Digital Selective Calling, DSC. DSC uses channel 70 to transmit bursts of data to convey information about safety, particularly distress. And all of the new radios that have been issued in recent years are equipped for DSC transmissions on 70. Old radios use channel 70 as a ship-to-ship talking channel. Channel 70 is no longer legal for talking on it. The new radios will not permit you to talk on it, but somebody with an old radio may still be able to get there, and you need to discourage that because that could interfere with the distress information that would be transmitted. Anytime you use any radio, you need to be listening before you start anything. And on channel 16, you want to be listening to hear if there's any need for assistance in your vicinity when you are not actually communicating on another channel. The highest priority of discussion is a call for distress. The pro word that indicates distress is Mayday. This comes from French because the international treaties at this time emphasize the French. So Mayday is French for come help me. It means your vessel is in imminent danger, you're sinking, you're going to die, you want help now. If you're not quite that endangered, but you have an urgent message, the second priority level is an urgency call, which is pronounced as PON. Now I know your book says it's PAWN, pronounced pawn. I have only heard a couple of times in 50 years with the pawn. Most of it is PON. And it indicates we have important information. The Coast Guard will use this if they have a report of a vessel in need of assistance, but they're not actually talking to that vessel. So they want everybody in the vicinity to be aware that there may be a need. If they have an overdue vessel, they'll use PON. I've had vessels call and say, the skipper has just had an injury and nobody else knows how to operate the boat. A pon call says they need assistance, but the boat isn't in imminent danger yet, but it could be soon. Third level of priority is safety. And a safety broadcast is announced with the pro word securite. A securite message indicates there's either a hazard to navigation or a concern for navigation. It could be a log floating. It could be a large vessel coming into a narrow channel. It could be an aids navigation that's not operating as advertised, and it's of general information. So to indicate that your traffic falls into one of these three categories, you would precede it with the pro word Mayday, pon, or securite. Now, if it doesn't fall into one of those categories, then we fall into general transmission. And generally, you're going to make an initial contact with another vessel, and as soon as you can, switch to another working channel. So you will just call the vessel on the hailing channel. When they reply, agree on the working channel you're shifting to and clear off the channel so it's available for anybody else that needs it. If at any time somebody is using the frequency for a higher priority than your traffic, you should not be using the channel. So if somebody is making an urgent broadcast and you want to make a call, you wait until they're done. In general, if you're calling somebody on channel 16 or 2182, you are permitted to call them for up to 30 seconds. Typically, it's not going to take anywhere near 30 seconds to get your FCC call and the name of the vessel you're hailing. And then you are supposed to wait at least 2 minutes. In real practice, you're going to very seldom hear people waiting that long. But they might be answering another telephone. They might be plotting something. Now, 2 minutes is a reasonable time for them to get back to you if they heard. After 2 minutes, you can call them again. Again, no more than 30 seconds on the call. Wait for 2 minutes again. If you still don't get a reply, you can make a third call. And if you do not get a response after the third call, the rules say you're supposed to wait 15 minutes. They do allow an exception that says if the channel's not being used, if you wait at least 3 minutes, then you can try calling them again. But if they didn't hear 3 calls, there's probably something wrong with the radio, or they're on a different channel, or they're not going to answer you at all. So after your 15 minutes, you can start all over again and try the calling procedure again. There's the overriding rule that says if it's an emergency, time limits don't apply. Do what you need to do to rescue lives and people. When you shift off of 2182 for the HF frequencies, you need to find an appropriate frequency for the vicinity that you're operating and the type of traffic that you're going to have. The one that keeps showing up in the homework, as if we all had HF radios, what is a frequency that you can use in all areas? 2638. They don't show the Coast Guard. If you were talking to the Coast Guard, you would go to 2670. But since we aren't using HF, that's not a real problem. Of course, these are all upper sideband frequencies now. In the VHF band, you need to pull out your chart first before you make the contact to figure out what channel you're going to be shifting to. If you're going to be talking about ship-to-ship safety, you can always go to 6. Of course, you have the international distress hailing and ship-to-ship safety. Recreational boats could hail on channel 9. If you don't get an answer, I would try hailing on 16 because they don't have to listen to 9. And channel 70 is not going to be used for voice. That is only used for digital selective calling now. Ship-to-ship working frequencies still have a primary use of safety. Anybody who's talking ship safety, distress, urgency, safety has priority. Vessel movement, operation, navigation is second level. Now we get into an authorization in VHF that says you can use it for non-commercial uses, not to interfere with anybody else. Now, rules say you should not talk for any longer than 3 minutes on any working channel. And after you finish your communication for 3 minutes, you should wait 10 minutes before you go back and contact the same people. Somewhere it's going to say you need to identify your transmissions every 15 minutes, which doesn't seem to make sense because if you can only talk 3 minutes, you should not be talking 15 minutes in the first place. But regardless of what you're choosing for your frequency, if a safety concern develops, that's going to have priority. If you have a permanent station license issued by the FCC, that's going to be your designated call sign. Generally, you will use the vessel name and the call sign. So you might identify yourself as the vessel Sigina, Whiskey Zulu Whiskey 29658. The identification is going to be made at the beginning of each transmission and the end of each communication. In between, you can use an abbreviated. After you've used your FCC call and you've contacted somebody, you can just use the boat name until you get to the end of the communications and then give the FCC call again to identify the end of the transmission. This is where the rule says you must identify yourself at intervals not exceeding 15 minutes. The only place that I can think that this is going to apply is either the automated information, the AIS, or on an EPIRB, which is going to be broadcasting continuously. But in your voice transmissions, you should never be talking 15 minutes, so it's not going to be a problem. If you don't have a FCC call sign, then you're just going to use the name of the vessel. If the vessel doesn't have a name, I would recommend coming up with a reasonable name before you transmit, because you don't want to just say, I'm the boat, because that's not very clear who you are. And you probably don't want to use personal information. You don't want to say, this is Charlie Brown. Transmitter adjustments have to be performed by first class or second class radio telegraph license holders or general radio telephone license holders. When they are working on your radio, they're responsible for leaving it in a legal configuration. And you should also have them enter the work that they've done in your log so that you will have a record of what's been done. Talked about grounding antennas, particularly for the HF, the high frequency single side band. If the hull is a metal hull, you have a beautiful ground. If it's not metal, you'll want to put a plate on the outside of the hull to which your grounding strap will attach, and this will suffice to get the ground into the water. VHF antennas probably don't need grounding. If they do, they will have that information when you purchase them. Changing channels here. It is not legal to share information that you hear on the radio except for distress or public information broadcasts. There's a law that says it's illegal to share the information. Whether you be the licensee, whether you be the operator, or just somebody passing, you can't share the information with people unnecessarily. The exception being, if it's a distress call, of course, that information should be shared with anybody that can help. And if it's a general broadcast, such as if the Coast Guard is making a weather broadcast, that information can be shared, but only if it's addressed to all vessels. The radio is a very big party line. Of course, we don't have party lines on many phones nowadays, but obscenity, indecency, and profanity are not permitted. Not only are they illegal, but they can be penalized with fines, they can be penalized with loss of licenses, and they can even lead to significant jail time. Probably the biggest violation will be a false distress call. The book will talk about some of the penalties that you can run into. I think the only one that they really ask you for is what are the penalties you can run into if you make a false distress call, and they are massive. The important thing is there are different ranges, and if you are ever notified of a violation, the first thing you want to do is acknowledge receipt. If the FCC doesn't get any response, they will presume that you are guilty and they will act accordingly. They may revoke the station license, which means you no longer can use that radio. They may revoke the operator license, which says you no longer can talk on any radio. They may have fines, or there may be, in severe cases, of imprisonment. But to minimize the effects of anything, be sure you get back to them. If you explain mitigating situations, they may understand and say, just give you a warning. But ignore them and you can very quickly increase the penalties. The licensee is responsible for transmissions. The book talks about the situation of what happens if a radio is in a general location. Licensee still needs to maintain control. So you don't have passengers picking up the microphone and talking like the kids that were on the radio not too long ago. Hello, hello, anybody out there? Can you hear me? I'm sinking, hello. If we could identify those people, they would be subject to penalties. So the licensee is responsible for the operation of the radio. First thing you want to do is avoid unnecessary calls. Before you transmit on any radio, you should always listen to make sure that the frequency is not already in use. In your initial call, you're going to identify your station and the stations you're calling. Here we go, prevent unauthorized use. do not continuously call. How long do you spend between each call? 3 minutes. I'm sorry, 2 minutes. And then at the end of 3 calls, 15 minutes. After your conversation is over, 10 minutes before you call back. Who makes technical repairs? You will need to know those license categories by sight when you see them. Normally, you will not be testing your radio, but a licensed repair person can call the Coast Guard and ask for a test. They will identify themselves, and the Coast Guard will respond to those tests, but it's better if you can find another station. When you talk on the radio, it is important to speak across the microphone. Speaking into it can lead to popping or other air impact that's going to make it difficult to understand. You need to be loud enough to be understood over background noise, but not so loud that you're going to be distorting the signal. You want to try to speak clearly. I had a choir teacher that said you always want to enunciate and project, and those are good skills on a radio transmission as well. They say hold the microphone 2 to 6 inches from your lips. I would suggest holding it 1 or 2 inches off center. So you're actually talking across the front of your microphone instead of into it. And that avoids the impact, but still maintains clarity. We have a coming lesson which will talk about pro words, which are procedural words. By using common pro words, you can minimize confusion and ensure clarity. Some of the pro words you are probably familiar with would be over. I'm done with my transmission and I'm expecting a reply. Out. I'm finished with my transmission and I don't expect a reply. Roger, I understand your message. Wilco, I understand and will comply with your message. And by using these words, you can economize the amount of time you're on the air and still not sacrifice clarity. Similarly, you should know the phonetic alphabet. There are a number of phonetic alphabets around. The military is using one specific one that you should know. This allows you to spell in an unambiguous way so that there is no question in what you mean when you need to clarify a spelling. The old specialty courses used to have practical demonstrations, and one of the practical demonstrations was to recite the phonetic alphabet. Another one was to know all of the signal flags. Fortunately, we don't have the signal flags anymore in this course. When you're operating your radio, if you need to make a test, your procedure will be to transmit your identification and announce that you're making a test after, of course, listening to make sure there's nothing else going on the frequency. It doesn't help if there's nobody to hear your test, so you really should have established communications with somebody who's going to report the results of the test and make it as brief as possible. Generally, it will be a count of 0 to 1 and 0 to 5 and 5 back to 0, or a long count 1 to 10 and back. And then you would identify your station again. They say regular testing is recommended. I would really challenge that, because standard radio procedures say anytime you're in conversation with a station, if they are not loud and clear, you should tell them what they are. So anytime you're talking to somebody, if they don't tell you otherwise, you're getting a radio check that says you're loud and clear. If they come back and say, you are loud with background static, or you are weak and garbled, then you have a reason to check your radio to see if you are off frequency or transmitting with some sort of problem. The Coast Guard does not allow legally radio checks with them, except for the licensed technicians who are authorized. If you're on an auxiliary facility and you're going out on patrol, when you check in and you tell them you're getting underway, if they do not tell you that you are not loud and clear, you are receiving a radio check that says you're okay. Now, the book will tell you how the radio systems progressed. It started out with a national distress program that was being developed at the turn of the century. And then it was expanded by international treaty to the Global Maritime Distress and Safety System, GMDSS. The neat thing about this GMDSS was it introduced the idea of digital selective calling. Radios are going to be assigned a unique MMSI number, Maritime Mobile something, I don't remember the others, that will be registered to the radio, so that every time the radio keys up, it transmits that number and somebody can look it up if they need to know who is talking to them. So if you are syncing and your radio is tied into your GPS receiver, you can just press a button on the key on the face of the radio and it sends out a signal on channel 70 in data burst, and it sends the fact that you're in distress, it sends your MMSI, it sends your position, and if you have coded in what the distress is for, it will tell people what you need help for, and then it will shift your radio immediately to channel 16 so you can continue the conversation on channel 16. All of this requires the radio to have two things: a link to your GPS, and you have to have programmed the appropriate MMSI number into it. Sometimes doing vessel safety checks, come across people that have put new radios in their boat who did not get an MMSI number issued, and the radio doesn't have one, and they don't realize that the distress button won't help them because the radio will not send a distress message without an identifier number. Now, with the GPS attached, it will automatically send a digital reading of the position. And as I say, channel 70 is used for these data bursts. So if you have old time fishermen who are still using channel 70 to talk, they may interfere with the transmissions without realizing what they're doing. So use of voice on channel 70 is no longer permitted. Radio watch on 16 by cargo and passenger ships is no longer required because their radios will be triggered by the channel 70 distress blurb. And the DSC also allows you to call another vessel digitally if you know their MMSI number. It's not the most convenient thing. It's probably going to be easier to call them by voice on 16, but with the MMSI number of the other vessel programmed into your set, you can contact them and have them automatically switch to a working channel and continue the conversation there. There we go. Marine Mobile Service Identity. So it's like your radio phone number if people don't know how else to call you. You can get them if you aren't legally required to have them from Boat US or CTO. Last I knew, they were no expense, so that you could request them free. Supplementing the digital selective calling is a program automatic information system where your radio can broadcast a position. Well, I guess I'm a slide ahead of myself. Your radios with DSC, digital selective calling, can transmit several all ships calls. You can send a distress call. You can request any vessel within range to respond with their position, and that will come back digitally. Or you can call an individual vessel with their MMSI. Before hitting the red button, if you program the radio for the nature of distress, you can tell people whether you are on fire, sinking, capsized, or whatever. And then it will transmit on channel 16 and you can continue by voice. It will also receive these signals and store them in a digital log so that you can look back. Of course, the recreational boat radios have very small screens. They aren't the easiest to read, but the information is there if you need to recall a position for distress or proceed for assistance. And Boat US has a tutorial available on the internet. If you jot down the internet address on the bottom of the screen, boatus.com/MMSI, that you can go and play with some of the functions on a safe model on the internet. Now the automated information system is tied into the MMSI so that the vessel will be transmitting its position regularly, which can be displayed on graphic screens to help you with your plotting. It can be cross-referenced with a chart plotter to indicate where you are. It will show the vessel or the identity of the vessels that you are looking at, their direction of travel, their speed. Sometimes it will show their next port. It says transponders are coming down in expenses. Last time I checked, if you just got the simple transmit transponder, it was about $800. I'm not sure if that's quite ready for us yet. You can get programs on the internet to review where ships are. I like to watch the icebreakers on the Great Lakes. National Distress System was updated into a new program called Rescue 21, which now is completely compatible with the Global Maritime Distress System. It has been augmented throughout the Great Lakes and the Western Rivers and Alaska and Hawaii. It is now in full operation throughout the country. And that brings us to the review questions. Bob, do you want to do any of these or run through yours?
Do you want to go through these and then I'll do the other ones since we're doing really good with time?
Okay. The numbers in the column here correspond to the numbers in the book. So question number 3, an efficient listening watch is required on which VHF channel and under what condition? On the International Distress and Healing, channel 16. Always when the VHF radio is on and not being used to communicate on another channel. Number 4, when a station does not respond to a call sent 3 times at intervals of 2 minutes, you are permitted to call again after how many minutes?
$15.
15 is correct. If the frequency is not in use, then you might shorten that to 3 minutes. Question 5, what is the basic procedure to initiate a call on a ship's radio telephone? What's the very first thing?
Call sign.
Listen.
See if the channel's free.
Well, first thing they will say, they presume you're on the correct channel. So the first thing you do is listen. Then call the vessel that you're trying to contact. When you contact them, agree on a working channel and switch. And something like that sounds like it's going to be an all of the above because they've got several aspects in there. This jumps to question 8. After 2 ship stations have established contact on an intership working frequency, FCC regulations limit the maximum duration of the communication for what period of time?
3 minutes.
3 minutes is correct. Question 14. What is the VHF distress and calling frequency? Oh, I'll tell you, this question is another one of those that I scratch my head about. Distress and calling frequency for the GMDSS. They're going to say channel 70. But I still say 16 is the distress and calling frequency. And this is data transmission, but they're grading your tests. So remember the way they've asked the question and how they have given you the answer.
And Mike, I think this might be a typo too, because I think it's 18 and not 14. It shows it being 14, but I think it shows up as question 18.
Well, give me half a second here.
I
In
showed
the
it.
old book, it's question 16.
It's on chat, is it question 16?
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry, I skipped over channel 16. You're right, it's 16.
Okay, it's 16, yeah. Okay,
Okay,
so I mislabeled that one.
I'm sorry. Is that question 16 or that channel 16?
It's question 16. And the question and the answer came from the National PowerPoint. So it's question 16. And they're saying the answer is Charlie, C.
Okay.
But the answer given, is it 70 or is it channel 16?
According to the course literature that I've looked at, when they talk about the GMDSS, they're going to say the distress channel is 70.
Well, again, in the appendix, the answer is given as 16.
Oh, isn't this great?
It's on page 20, yeah. Sorry, but that's what it says.
No, I don't have that information. I don't have your answer keys, so I'm glad you have that. And 16 is what I would have chosen if I didn't have their PowerPoint.
So
I'm not grading your tests, so I can't tell you what they're gonna do.
okay.
Number 9, all transmitter adjustments to marine radio telephone transmitters must be performed by or under the immediate supervision of a person holding which class? And in this case,
All of the above.
there are multiple, yes.
Yeah.
First class radio telegraph, second class radio telegraph, general radio telephone.
Mhm.
Number 10, the secrecy provision of the communications regulations does not apply to what type of communication?
Distress.
Distress.
Distress and broadcasts intended for general dissemination.
Mhm.
And they didn't have that part, so it would just be the Bravo. What are some of question 11? What are some of the violations which can cause license revocation or fines against the licensee or operator?
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Now, those are pretty easy to recognize. If your mother would wash your mouth out with soap, the FCC will do the same thing. Question 12. What are desirable voice characteristics when speaking on a radio?
Speaking tone.
The only answer there in the choices would be the Charlie, C.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
And number 15, which single sideband working frequency can be used in all areas? Like we're going to have single sideband. Yeah. The frequency is
2638.
very good. And that comes to the end of that PowerPoint. So
So you want me to go through the ones that we didn't cover so far, Mike?
if you would like, I don't have those. I don't have the answer key with what I have. And
Well,
is
great
that
job.
in the back
Thanks,
of the
Mike.
student manual?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll go over these and then we'll bounce it open for everybody that has any questions. So question number 1, the correct answer I have in here is A, FCC.
Right.
Question number 2, B is the correct answer, 2182 kilohertz. Question number 6, they're looking for B. Question number 7, they're also looking for B. Question 13, the correct answer is B. Question 14, the correct answer is B. Number 17, the correct answer is B. Number 18, for DSC, they're looking for, the answer is C. Number 19, they're looking for D. Number 20, the fines, it's B. And number 21, they're looking for B, 10 minutes. If you want, you can go ahead and turn on your cameras. Outstanding job, Mike. Thanks for doing it. Mike's going to come back and join us for chapter 4. Mr. Chris Stallman will be here on next Tuesday. So there was some questions. Some of you might not have gotten the email, but we have decided instead of going twice a week and having 4 chapters per week, which is going to be pretty difficult, the instructors have decided just to have classes on Tuesday. So if you're planning on classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays and being done in 3 weeks, I apologize. But what we're going to do, just so that everybody can not get overwhelmed, is do Tuesday nights only, 2-hour time period. Some of the chapters later on are a little more detailed, so we might push a little over that 2-hour time limit. On your, if you get your little mouse and scroll across the bottom, you should see reactions. So if you see where that is on the bottom, scroll across the bottom. So my reaction for Mike is a hand clap. So if you want to give Mike a hand clap or a thumbs up for his presentation tonight, I think he definitely deserves it. Great job, Mike.
You're being very generous. I thank you.
And any other questions before we wind this down? We got about 7 minutes left for any questions. If you are there's 2 different pages, which is exciting. If you are a watch stander right now and you're doing this just for a review, go ahead, go to reactions and give me a thumbs up. Curious if any of you are already doing some watch standing and just wanted to bone up. Not too many. Kelly, are you a watch stander? And Walter, you're a watch stander. Good job. So as you know, from the emails we've been getting, the all AUX, the active duty is dealing with a staffing shortages. So they're looking for our help. And some of you may be very far away from your nearest Coast Guard station. But for the local stations here in the Chicago area, they've kindly invited us to come out and assist with watch standing. And what their expectations are is we wear the uniform appropriately and correctly and show proper courtesy while we're on the station. So for some of you that may have considered becoming participants in watch standing at the active duty, I think they're going to be really happy to have you participate. Any other questions before we wind it down for the night?
Well, just the comment that this course will not be adequate to become a watchstander. You will have to have the telecommunication operator, and then the Coast Guard has their own qualifications that extend that. But this is a good start.
Yeah, Robert says he's in southwestern Colorado. Yes, it would be a very long commute for you, Robert, to get to your nearest Coast Guard station.
But if we're already TCO'd, it shouldn't be too difficult of a process, correct?
It will be very helpful. This information you're getting in this class also very helpful and will put you head and shoulders above someone who's just got the TCO.
And will having a ham radio operator's license help at all?
Also, obviously a huge benefit. If you're familiar with ham radios and know how to operate them, that's awesome too. So, but it's exciting to understand that we're at a historic time when the auxiliary, when the active duty is really encouraging us to become even more active. Obviously, with COVID, we lost some very good people, and so there's a big need from the active duty's point of view for more help. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut off the recording now.